Tiz, a vulnerable young Brazilian girl, finds herself speeding through the night towards the lights of a big city. Her companion is a man who has promised her parents that he will find their daughter work as a maid. What awaits her there is something different, however, and her life becomes increasingly fraught with danger, both mental and physical.
Interwoven into this tragic and violent storyline is the account of a young doctor whose life and love affair in the south of England are in stark contrast to the dangerous, sexually abusive situation in which Tiz finds herself. Yet their stories and that of their families become closely linked. You are listening to Tiz from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight by Deborah Varon. Part 17. Excited Delight. Chinn, a migrant worker in a Brazilian city, had snatched his friend Tiz, a prostitute in a local brothel, and taken her to a hospital for treatment. He has never been in a hospital before, so when his turn comes to be admitted into the waiting room, he carries Tiz in and wonders what to do next.
There he stood, not sure what to do next, while his arms ached, and the patients and their relatives walked around him as if he wasn't there. The noise, too, confused him, as babies were screaming, children crying, and patients were chatting to each other at the tops of their voices. At last, a helpful orderly took his number and, leading him down a corridor, showed him into a small, sparsely furnished consulting room. Chinn laid Tiz on the couch and sat down on a chair, profoundly grateful, not only to have escaped from the waiting room, but to be inside the hospital at last. Abstractedly he ran his hands through his hair, willing the doctor to come soon before it was too late. Tiz lay on the couch, eyes glazed, rolling restlessly from side to side and gasping in an alarming way. Magdalena had managed to find an old pair of jeans and a t-shirt for her to wear, but these were far too large for her emaciated body and made her seem even smaller and more shrunken. At last the door opened and two men in white coats came into the room. One was portly and much older than the other, with an air of confidence about him, which seemed to indicate that he was the senior of the two. He was speaking in a foreign language to the younger man, who was tall and thin and appeared to be in his early 20s.
"What's the matter with your wife?" said the senior doctor to Chinn in Portuguese. "She's just a friend," replied Chinn, "and I don't know what the matter is. She seems to be finding it difficult to breathe. She's desperately ill. Please save her, doctor."
The doctor made no reply, but turned to the slight body lying on the bed, looking grave. He spoke to her, but she made no reply, seeming totally unaware of anything that was going on. Indeed, it took the combined efforts of all three of them to hold her in an upright position, in order that the senior doctor might sound her chest. She sat on the couch in their arms, lolling like a floppy rag doll.
After he'd finished, and his patient was once more lying down, he turned to Chinn and said gravely, "Your friend has pneumonia. What did you say she did for a living?" "She's a prostitute, doctor," replied Chinn quietly. The doctor pursed his lips and stood looking thoughtfully down at the slight body on the couch. At last he turned to Chinn and said sadly, "Given her occupation, I think there's a good chance that she may have AIDS-related pneumonia." Chinn looked despairingly at the doctor. "Is she dying?" he asked in a low voice. "Let's hope I'm wrong," replied the doctor, not answering the question. He then added thoughtfully, "Whatever form of pneumonia she has, she's desperately ill, so I should stay near the phone. I'll admit her to hospital, and we must hope that we can save her. I'll send a clerk to fill in the necessary forms. You do have a telephone, I hope, he added ominously.
Chinn gave the number of the shop and watched numbly as both men left the room, talking together in grave tones. Almost immediately, 2 orderlies appeared with the trolley. Tiz was lifted onto it, where she lay with eyes closed, barely moving. The trolley was wheeled out and the door closed. She was gone. Chinn sat down on the chair, feeling as if all the life had been drained out of him too. Now that he could do no more, he felt exhausted and depressed. If only he'd gone to the Sparkling Delight sooner, she would have had a better chance of surviving. But now it looked as if it was too late. After all the admissions procedures were completed, Chinn made his way back to the shop, wondering miserably if he would ever see Tiz alive again. When he walked through the door, Louis and Bruno greeted him cheerfully. They'd enjoyed looking after the business on their own and were still high on the excitement of the morning.
"How'd you get on, boss?" questioned Bruno, still playing the gangster. Then, seeing the misery on Chinn's face, he fell silent, shuffling his feet in embarrassment. "Bad news?" queried Louis quietly. "Tiz may have age-related pneumonia," replied Chinn sadly. "The doctor doesn't think she'll make it." "Sorry, boss," muttered Bruno, and turning away got back to the work on the bicycle he was mending. Aidan and Kirsty were eating a late evening meal at the kitchen table. Although they'd been in Brazil for only 5 days, such a lot had happened, and there had been so many adjustments to make that it felt a great deal longer. Both had fallen in love with their small house and its beautiful surroundings. Kirsty had even discovered that from the netted front porch, with its wreaths of eye-catching cerise bougainvillea and fragrant frangipani, she could catch a glimpse of the estuary.
However, dinner was not going well. Joy had woken early for her last meal of the day, so Kirsty was trying to feed her, while at the same time eating her own food and also catching up with Aidan's day. "How was the hospital, darling?" she inquired distractedly.
"I'm still shadowing Dr. Ramirez," answered Aidan briefly, without looking up from his plate.
"Joy and I went to the market on our own this morning for the first time. No Sister Maria to hold our hands," remarked Kirsty after a pause. "I've even managed to make friends with one of the stallholders who can speak a little English. I said, 'Hello, how are you?' to him in Portuguese, but that just made him laugh." Still no response. At last she said sharply, "What's the matter, Aidan? You've hardly said 2 words during the whole of dinner. Has something bad happened at work?"
Aidan looked up from the mango he was eating and smiled at her, seeming to see her properly for the first time since the meal began. "How beautiful you look, Kirsty," he said lovingly. "Being a mother really suits you."
"Oh, Aidan, how can you say that?" she replied, laughing ruefully. "I must look a fright. Hair in a mess, no makeup, and breastfeeding a baby."
"Darling, you make a beautiful picture just as you are, with Joy so happy and contented cuddled in your arms. You don't know how lovely you look. Do you remember the sculpture of the Holy Family in the cathedral? Well, you look just like that, and I'm here to protect both of you."
Kirsty put down her fork, reached over the table, trying hard not to disturb the baby, and gave his hand a squeeze. "I thought of them too in the plane coming over," she said, smiling. "You make a good Joseph, Aidan. Joy and I feel really safe and cherished. But you still haven't answered my question, sweetheart. What's the matter?" Aidan looked thoughtful again.
"I'm worried," he answered. "We had a poor girl come in this morning to the outpatients department, suffering from pneumonia, and I'm not sure she's going to last the night. She was one of the most pathetic scraps of humanity I've ever seen in my life. I just have a feeling that I ought to look in on her before we turn in for the night. I'm not sure why I want to. I only know I shall feel happier if I see she's still alive. I know which ward she was sent to. Would you mind? I won't be long.
No, of course not, replied Kirsty. I know you. You won't settle until you've checked. Try not to be too long, though. Joy might even let us have 4 or 5 hours now she's been fed. Bending down, she gently kissed the golden halo of down on top of the baby's tiny head, and then smiled lovingly across the table at her husband, glad that he really cared about his patients.
Taking his torch, Aidan set out along the small path that led from the house to the long, single-storey wards built among the trees. The scent of frangipani filled the air, and the moon, which was nearly full, illuminated the night with her silvery magic. Aidan could see the twinkling lights of ships on the estuary, and the far-distant hills silhouetted against the moonlit sky. For a brief moment he stood looking out over the tranquil scene. Not so tranquil as it looks, he thought to himself suddenly, noticing some black storm clouds massing over the sea. I'd better hurry.
On entering the women's medical ward by a door at the far end, he found a nurse in a small office sitting at a desk, busily filling in forms. The ward itself was in semi-darkness, but the small room was brilliantly lit, the light spilling out to illuminate the nearer beds. She looked up inquiringly as he came into the room and said something to him in Portuguese.
Hoping she spoke English, Aidan said slowly, "We had a patient in Dr. Ramirez's clinic this morning with acute pneumonia. I have come to check her, if I may. Where is she?"
"She is in the little room at the end of the ward," said the nurse in halting English. "She is very ill, poor girl, very ill. Perhaps she dies." And she raised her shoulders and held out both hands, looking sadly at him.
"I hope you're wrong," he thought gloomily as he began to walk down the length of the ward between the 2 parallel rows of beds. Glancing around, he noticed that some of the patients were still awake. These stared at him curiously as he quietly passed by, but most were asleep, snatching a few brief hours of relief from their troubles.
He opened the door to the small room where the girl lay, and sat down for a moment on the wooden chair beside the bed, scanning her face with concern. It was a stifling, airless night, so she lay spread-eagled on top of the sheets, her breath coming in quick, harsh gasps. A single low-powered electric light bulb hanging from the centre of the ceiling shed enough light for him to see that one of her small hands was tightly clutching some unidentifiable object. Rising from his seat, he bent down, gently released her hold, and extricated a beautiful shell, which appeared to be loosely wrapped in 2 bits of grubby cloth. He placed it quietly on the bedside locker, and was about to throw the wrappings in the bin by the bed, when a flash of colour caught his eye, and he found himself looking at a couple of letters, an A and a V, intertwined with 2 beautifully embroidered little fish.
He sat back down heavily on the chair. What could this mean? A. V. Those were his father's initials, Andrew Vickers. There was no doubt that these were 2 of his grandmother's hankies. Frantically he searched in his pocket and drew out a handkerchief embroidered with an identical monogram. He looked at it in disbelief, and then at the grubby bits of rag in his other hand. As far as he knew, he'd never lost any of the handkerchiefs his grandmother had embroidered for his father. Certainly not here in this hospital. And then a memory from long ago began to surface. He saw in his mind's eye the sun setting over the ocean, and outlined black against the gold, a small child's silhouette, arms upraised, then a boat, and a small sleeping girl, with a beautiful heart-shaped face lying in its lee. He seemed to feel again the heat of the sun as he bent to cover the bare limbs with sand, and the elfin features with one of these now dirty hankies. But what of the other? How did she get that one? Suddenly, fear and horror gripped his heart as another, more unwelcome memory resurfaced of a cheap brothel and a terrified young prostitute. Drawing a long, shuddering breath, he heard a voice scream in his head. "It's her! You covered her face with it, you coward! You couldn't even bear to look at her after what you did. It's her! It must be her! And now she's dying!"
Dropping the 3 handkerchiefs, Aidan sat down heavily on the chair. His mind seemed to be on fire and he couldn't think. His breath came in short gasps, and he felt as if a huge weight was being pressed down on his chest. At last he managed to lift his eyes and take another look at the figure on the bed. This time he took in every part of her. Her face. Yes, that could well be the grown-up face of the child who nestled beside the boat all those years ago. But she was so appallingly thin. Suddenly he noticed that the moon, shining through the window frame, had formed a black cross over the body on the bed. Her motionless, bare, emaciated legs and matchstick arms stuck out on either side of the shadow symbol, making it look as if she'd been crucified. His mind immediately sprang back to the picture in Father James' cell of Christ contorted and mangled on his cross.
"And you too," Aidan whispered to himself, his words barely audible. Why did it have to be you they crucified? Can't anyone escape? In deep despair he rose from his seat and made his way past the rows of sleeping patients and back up the path to his house. There he found Kirsty already in bed waiting for him. Aidan slipped off his clothes and joined her. Joy was asleep in the crib by the window, and they could hear her quick, quiet breathing. Aidan took Kirsty in his arms. He held her tightly, feeling her comfortable, reassuring covering of flesh. Raising himself on one elbow, he looked at her beautiful face, lying trustingly beside him on the pillow, with its frame of auburn curls, mellowed now to a silvery gold by the transforming moonlight. With one finger he traced the outline of her eyes, nose and full mouth, the curve where neck met shoulder, and the bountiful shape of her breasts, now the palest, most delicate alabaster in the lambent light from the window. But as he gazed down at her, the oncoming rain cloud slid across the moon, and they were plunged into darkness. For a long moment he sat staring into the blackness, listening to the first heavy raindrops spattering the window screens.
Then the storm struck the little house in all its frenzy. Rain thrummed a deafening rhythm on the roof, and the wind harried and tormented the trees outside. Continuous sheet lightning, awful in its violent beauty, lit up the room, and thunder crashed and reverberated out over the sea. "Hold me tight," said a small voice from the bed beside him after a particularly loud rolling clap. "I do hope Joy doesn't wake." But she did. So all 3 of them lay wrapped up in bed together, waiting for the storm to pass. At length, the last distant roll of thunder died away, and Aidan returned the baby to her crib. Wide awake now, and with the mind no longer distracted by the noise, he got back into bed and drew Kirsty roughly to him.
That night his love-making had a desperate frenzy about it. It was almost as if a frantic attempt at exorcism was taking place deep within his body. When it was over, he sat up in bed, wrapped his arms round his long legs, and drew some deep, shuddering breaths.
"What's the matter, Aidan?" inquired Kirsty anxiously out of the darkness. "I don't know the man who's just made love to me. Please tell me, what's gone wrong?"
"It's her, Kirsty. It's her," he replied in a low, desperate voice.
"Who?" replied Kirsty, perplexed. "Who, Aidan? Whoever are you talking about?" Like a dying sigh came the reply.
"The girl I've just been to see is the same girl I raped in the brothel."
"How could you know that?" exclaimed Kirsty in astonishment. "She'd be different now, even if you thought you recognised her. It can't be her. There must be hundreds of girls in this city who look just like her."
"Oh, but it is. She has my 2 hankies, the ones I gave her. You know, the ones with the A.V. and the fishes that my grandmother embroidered for my dad. She's dying, Kirsty. What can I do?"
"How on earth did you get 2 of your grandma's hankies?" asked Kirsty in amazement. So Aidan then told her the story of how the 2 came to be in Tiz's possession. "It must be her then," said his wife thoughtfully. "It can't be anyone else, can it?"
"What's she ever done that she should end up like this?" groaned Aidan. "And there are thousands more like her, I know. Poor, forgotten women, dying from sexual abuse and AIDS. It seems to me sometimes," he went on bitterly, "that life is no more than a soulless machine. In at one end go the small, innocent girl children, and out at the other, like a river of sewerage, come their dead, battered bodies. The rubbish of the world, to be swept up into the dustbin without anyone noticing they've gone. And I don't even know her name," he added. "But then, why should I?" he muttered miserably. "She's only a prostitute."
Kirsty was silent for a long moment, trying to come to terms with this bleak picture of life. At last she spoke. "No, Aidan, it's not quite like that," she said slowly. "Yes, life may seem to be one vast machine to most of us, but if you think carefully you can see that there is, amazingly, a joke hiding in it."
"Joke?" replied Aidan, surprised. "Whatever do you mean? I don't see anything funny."
"Just this," replied Kirsty. "We are the joke in the machine, you and I. We care. We love. We've come here to learn how to do something to give meaning to lives like these. Surely every act of love and compassion means that the machine ceases to be merely a machine for an instant. Everything you would do as a doctor, Aidan, beginning with your care for this girl now, means that they become real human beings, not just forgotten refuse crushed by some relentless cosmic juggernaut."
Silence fell for a long moment as Aidan thought about this. The moonlit room was quiet and still now, the only sounds coming from the rhythmic breathing of the baby in her cot and the distant sounds of traffic outside the convent walls. At last he spoke. "I hope you're right," he said quietly, "and if she lives until tomorrow, I'm going to do everything I can to save her."
"I'll help you, Aidan," said Kirsty, sitting up in bed beside him and putting her arm around his shoulder. She was silent for a moment and then said slowly, "There's another thing that troubles me, though."
"What's that?" queried Aidan.
"It's just that life is so unfair," she replied slowly. "Here I am, a a fairly average Western woman with a wonderful marriage, a home, a family, a career, and I feel I have a right to all those things. But these girls have no status, no rights, no future even. Somehow it seems so unjust. They can't help where they're born, can they?
No, they can't, replied Aidan grimly. That's why I'm going to do my damnedest to save this one. Then he paused and added almost under his breath, if she lives.
But live she did. And when the sun rose in the sky, inexorably waking the world to another day, it was to find Tiz still miraculously clinging on to life.
Carlos, Anna and Davy were sitting eating their evening meal in Tiz's old home in the village. On Anna's lap sat an 18-month-old baby girl. Night had fallen, and the room was lit by a weak electric light bulb suspended low over a container of rice and beans placed in the centre of the table. Its feeble beam illuminated the heads and faces of the eaters in a pale amber glow, while wisps of steam rising from the hot food formed a ghostly aura round the bowl. The rest of the room was in shadow.
I'm so glad you get one day off a month in this new job, Carlos, said Anna, reaching out and covering her husband's large hand with her small work-worn one. It goes so quickly, though, she added sadly. As soon as you're gone, we want you back again. Isn't that right, Davy?
Yes, replied Davy plaintively. But I want Tiz too. Where is she? Why doesn't she come home?
Oh, Davy, please don't say that any more, pleaded his mother, distressed. You know we've done all we can to find her. Manolo calls the number we were given constantly on his mobile, and he asks around for her each time he goes to Beleza. He told me he'd rung again only yesterday when he brought your dad home. There's never any answer. You know that.
Make your friend write another letter, said Davy flatly, turning to his father. Perhaps the first one didn't get there. Davy, replied Carlos gravely, I've sent 3. If the address is genuine, at least one of them would have got there by now. I can't think of anything else to do, he added despairingly.
Our Tiz seems to have disappeared off the face of the earth, doesn't she? Said Anna dismally. Every day I long to see her come running in at the door like she used to. Whatever can have happened to her? I've a feeling deep inside me that I'll never see her again. I pray I'm wrong. While they were eating, the wind began to rise and gust noisily round the dilapidated shack, finding chinks and gaps through which it squeezed to join the small family. Anna wrapped an old blanket around the baby, holding her tightly to try and keep out the draughts. She shivered, thinking how sad life had become now Tiz had disappeared.
You have been listening to Tiz from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight. You may find more information by searching the web for The Garden of Sparkling Delight.
Soaring to the skies with the wind in